Hoy vamos a estar hablando de un tema súper interesante que tiene que ver con un problema de escala internacional. En el año 2011, Sudán del Sur se independizó formalmente de Sudán. Luego del reconocimiento internacional, problemas étnicos dentro de este territorio dieron nacimiento al movimiento Rol Naath, que sostiene un reclamo de independencia y soberanía en estado avanzado. Este tipo de situaciones en el continente africano tienen que ver con un problema heredado de las antiguas potencias coloniales y los límites impuestos dentro del continente. En África hay innumerables reclamos independentistas sustentados mayormente en cuestiones de supresión a minorías étnicas. Para hablar de este tema, estamos en diálogo con el presidente de Rol Naath, Yual Chiek. It will be very interesting if you could give us a general overview about Rol Naath, because really is little information about it on the internet.
Absolutely. Well, Rol Naath is actually it's a term that means land or country of the people. So now, as you've heard, a member of the Nuer people, and actually, it's been said that we are the most anthropologically studied people in Africa and maybe even the world. And this is because the Nuer had a lot of interactions with the British Empire, in that they were very staunchly independent, and not just with the British Empire. They also had conflict with the Ottomans when the Ottomans came into the Sudan, and also with the Egypto-British condominium government, such that the British and the Ottomans had to arrange some sort of local administration because the Nuer were always so independently minded. So this is going back all the way to the 1800s. And when the Nuer decided to become part of Sudan, there was always a sense that they were independent. So the name that they call themselves is Ne to Naath, which means the people who are the people, and so therefore they named their country Rol Naath. I say all of that because I want to highlight the fact that, in a sense, Nuer independence is not anything new. They've always been independently minded since before colonialism, at least on the larger scale on the continent. And there was always this sense politically that in their minds that they were an independent people and they had a right to govern themselves and determine their own future. And so there was a sense of not being impressed with empires that came in and the like. And they would often say they'll fight to the last person to ensure that they have a sense of their own sovereignty, even when they were not as sophisticated in terms of knowledge of the world or politically with respect to their position in it. But there was always a staunch sense of independence. And now that they've sort of caught up with the world insofar as it comes to education and knowledge of the rest of the world and where humanity is going, that sense of independence and sovereignty, the stubborn desire to participate and to have a seat at the table, has only grown stronger. So, with respect to what Rol Naath is, it is something that's always been there insofar as an independent land, a conception of where their borders are, and of the Nuer themselves as a single nation and a people with a right to govern their own land. So we, in this time, are merely those that are bringing forward something that's always been part of us. We are not getting it from elsewhere, and we've always had a sense of the right to govern ourselves and our land according to our own system. So I hope that gives a bit of a background about what Rol Naath is.
What happened is that you didn't feel part of Sudan project and decided to separate from that country.
Okay, perfect. So in a funny way, the Nuer being not part of South Sudan or of the Sudan generally was something that was said by the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire would often go either in Eastern Europe or the rest of North Africa, as it were, to look for men to have in their slave armies. And so, just as they did in Eastern Europe, they would come into northern Sudan, into the Sudan area, and then would try to take men from the various ethnic groups around there to join their armies. And the Nuer would staunchly resist this, having the political belief that our sons shouldn't fight in battles that aren't theirs. And so it was sensed that that the Nuer have a totally different way of thinking of themselves, and oftentimes would be considered a sort of extreme independence. And so the Ottomans would say that the Nuer are not like the rest of the South Sudanese, that they're too hostile and the like, and so that they should not be considered as South Sudanese. And that idea was passed on to the Egypto-British condominium government, in which there was this sense that the Nuer ought not to be trusted as part of South Sudanese because they're too extremely independent, such that if they're allowed educational vocations or allowed to participate in the military fully, that in some sense they're going to be a danger in that they're too independently minded. So, the Egypto-British Sudan never really considered Nuer as part of South Sudan or as part of Sudan. And then when South Sudan came about, this sense that the Nuer are not part of South Sudan became a sort of prejudice. When the Dinka got in, it was also got into power in South Sudan. It was also the sense that that the Nuer should not be given high posts in with respect to military training and the like, because they were considered a danger. Even though the idea that there should be a South Sudan um, was actually a Nuer idea, and again, born out of this sense of strong independence. 70% of the SPLM were Nuer soldiers, and this is something that's recognized by all. In the 1950s, it was a Nuer by the name of Bodio who argued that the differential development between the Arab North and the mostly black South has to stop, and if it didn't, that the South would have a right to secede. And it was the Nuer who first moved that there should be a separation of South Sudan, and again, it was the Nuer who formed the backbone of the movement. So when it is said in South Sudan that the Nuer are unconfirmed, it's something deep that goes back to the times of the Ottoman Empire, where the Nuer were thought to be too extremely independent, and that they would pose a danger to any sense of imposing an outside order. So the Nuer themselves, in a way, have tried to show that no, we're cooperative, we're part of South Sudan and the like, but they haven't understood that no matter what they do, they won't be considered part of South Sudan because it is their very sense of individuality or freedom that is a danger to these sort of multi-ethnic states in which oftentimes there's corruption and human rights violations. So in that sense, the Nuer have not been considered part of South Sudan. And now many of the young people, the Nuer of this age, have just realized that all of this historical stuff in which we're not considered part of South Sudan is not something we should shy away from. It is, in fact, something we should simply accept that we're not going to be able to get along in these multi-ethnic states. It is not that Nuer have prejudice towards other groups or the like, but the Nuer feel that every ethnic group has the right to determine their future, and that relations should be relations that respect borders and the lands of various peoples, and that the connection should be along economic lines in terms of a cooperation of the region, not in terms of one state. We find that disorderly and what gives rise to the corruption and sort of ineffectiveness of African states and certainly of states in the region.
What is the situation of Rol Naath today? Do you control the territory? Do you trade? Do you interact with other countries?
Mhm. Yes, thank you. So the situation in Rol Naath right now is that the Nuer are de facto independent. The government of South Sudan is very weak in terms of its control over the territory that it is to govern over, and of course, a large amount of that is because of the rampant sort of incompetence and corruption that was within the Juba government. Secondly, the Juba government has repeatedly, since 2013, 2014, brought in foreign governments to effectively ethnically cleanse the Nuer region. So there was the involvement of the Ugandan government, various rebel forces from northern Sudan, as well as the buying out of ethnic groups that are closely not allied, but closely situated to the Nuer, upon the Nuer border, to essentially enact a campaign of terrorism of the people. They would even prevent UN food trucks from getting into the area to attempt to starve them out. I say all of this because the only ones that have been able to protect Nuer land have been the Nuer themselves. They have quite a sizable civil militia that is called the White Army. And that civil militia is probably the largest fighting force in the region. And so they have, since 2013, 2014, protected their land such that Nuer land is right now de facto independent. When it comes to trade with neighboring states, a large portion of Ethiopia, the Gambela region, the majority is Nuer. And so there's a lot of informal economic relations that happen between Ethiopia and Rol Naath. Secondly, because the government of South Sudan has been so weak and has effectively tried to starve out Nuer land, the Nuer, as Rol Naath, have been talking with other states in the region. And as of right now, Rol Naath is getting exports ready. We have a very strong agricultural section, and so we are getting agricultural exports ready. What is more, gum arabic, which is often an ingredient in medicines, it's an emulsifier, it's an ingredient in soft drinks. It appears that Rol Naath is probably the world's largest kind of deposit of it, if you could use that in that term, because it comes from the acacia tree, and most of our forests are essentially acacia trees, right? So there's a large industry there that we are also developing. So with Rol Naath, it's the Nuer people charting our own future because we find that this government is in its fullest sense out to ethnically cleanse us. So there is no choice but for us to look for economic interaction with others, and we've already begun that.
Okay, can we say that there is a war between South Sudan and Rol Naath right now?
Right now, we cannot say that there's a war outright between South Sudan and Rol Naath, although we can say certainly that South Sudan is interested in removing any sense of Rol Naath, any sense of a Nuer exit from South Sudan, because the majority of South Sudan's income comes from Rol Naath, because that's where the majority of the oil fields are. And so Rol Naath leaving would be disastrous for South Sudan. But it is not to say that there aren't resources in the rest of the country. There are. But the areas that have been extracted, the oil's been extracted from, are all in Rol Naath. So the Juba government is right now trying very hard to remove any sense of Nuer independence or secession from South Sudan. But the Juba government has its own problems because, again, as I keep repeating, the rampant corruption within the Juba government is made it such that its ethnically based government is not even able to contain itself because of the war partly because of the war in northern Sudan. The oil refineries have been shut down, and so the oil that would be extracted from Rol Naath and then sent by pipeline to Khartoum, where it would be extracted, then go out to the rest of the world, that has effectively been cut because of the war in Sudan, which means that the Juba government is running out of money and it's not able to maintain itself. So any problems that are occurring within South Sudan are not issues that are brought about by Rol Naath. Rol Naath is a peaceful movement, and effectively what our work has been is to speak with our people and to let them know you are already independent. When it comes to protecting your land, feeding your people, you're doing all of this by yourselves. You are in fact doing a better job than the Juba government has ever done or desires to do. So why not now look for friends in the rest of the world, those states that are practically minded, because Since 2005, the world has, particularly the Western world, has poured a lot of money into South Sudan to make it work. And the only thing that they've gotten are corruption, genocide, and effectively no return on their investment. And what Rol Naath is saying is that we don't want to be part of this dysfunction anymore. If it comes to protecting our area, we are able to protect our people from the Juba government. We have been doing that since 2013. And so there is no need for us to attack the Juba government. There's no need for us to attack South Sudan. It will fall of itself. So any destruction that happens to South Sudan will not be because Rol Naath has had any hand in it. It will be because of its own internal contradictions. So there is no war right now between Rol Naath and South Sudan. But if there's any aggression on the part of South Sudan, we must, of course, protect our people. So that's where things stand right now.
Okay, but do you have political relationship with South Sudan?
We don't have a political relationship with South Sudan. And the reason is this. Because the way South Sudan works, as I mentioned, there's sort of political corruption in there, is that if we don't have a clean break, then we would be pulled back into the confusion. And so the clean break is to say to our people that we are an autonomous region. We are behaving as an autonomous region that has no political connection with South Sudan. Because the political connection that South Sudan wishes to have is to say that, well, perhaps Rol Naath can be a region or it's just part of South Sudan, and then they want to classify the Rol Naath Authority as part of one of the many factions within South Sudan. And then once it's part of the factions, then they can say, let us have some sort of power sharing agreement. And the power sharing agreements never work. They have never worked in South Sudan. They have never worked effectively anywhere in Africa, to be honest, and certainly in South Sudan. And there are over 30 or 40 different factions. Many of these factions have no control. They have no mandate of the people that they supposed to represent, whereas Rol Naath has a mandate of the Nuer people. And we don't profess to be an authority over different ethnic groups or over territory that is not the territory of our people. So there are no internal contradictions among us. So it serves us no purpose at all to be part, to have any sort of political relationship with South Sudan along those lines. So we are not stakeholders in South Sudan, and South Sudan cannot be a stakeholder within Rol Naath. So in that sense, we are not in any political relationship with them. However, if South Sudan in the future wishes to have sort of formal business relationships and the like, of course, in the interest of regional cooperation, we would be interested in that, just as we would be interested in having relations with Tanzania or Ethiopia or Chad or any of the other countries in the region.
The ethnic conflict that you have in South Sudan is a common denominator that you can see in many African countries. Do you think that the general solution will come from the self-determination, the international intervention, or maybe the union and the mutual cooperation of the affected ethnic groups?
Good. Thank you. Let me start with the mutual cooperation of the affected ethnic groups. I don't think mutual cooperation between the affected ethnic groups is even possible before a recognition that the various ethnic groups have their land and have their territory. This is something that is often brought about by people as an either-or choice. But the reality is that there cannot be effective cooperation unless an ethnic group feels that its territory is recognized and that it has the right to sovereignty, the right to determine its future, to be a member at the table. Until then, how could there be any sort of cooperation? So I think that the first thing that has to be done is a recognition that there has to be a restructuring of the borders in Africa. So let's start with where many of the borders came from. When colonial powers divided up much of Africa, the division was not along um, was not along what would be best for the African states themselves or the African peoples themselves. It was not recognizing their various differences. It was merely on the interest of the European powers or the colonial powers, which is not itself something that is new with with the European colonial powers. The Romans had done that to Europe and the like, and the result is always that there is ethnic conflict, and in that ethnic conflict, you always get corruption, you always get genocides. Just think of the 100-year war in Europe, and that only ended when the Treaty of Westphalia. People realized, well, maybe we have to divide up this large territory, the Holy Roman Empire, into its various ethnic groups. And then this is where you have much of modern Europe. Then when the European powers came into Africa, they just did what the Romans had done to them, right? And so now, what would be the solution? I think it's clear that the solution is that Africa has to go back to making borders that are sensible for Africans. And if there is no understanding that we have to let go of these borders that are not African borders, they're not serving Africans. And the result is that not only they not serving Africans, they're actually not serving the rest of the world. With the increasing conflicts and genocides and corruption within these states, there is no real there's no real benefit that any of these states are getting from African countries. And so we argue that if on the scale of Africa, that if there's a restructuring of the borders, those ethnic groups that can stand on their own and wish to stand on their own as independent, I think they of course should be allowed to do so. Secondly, if there are ethnic groups that tend to get along and that cooperate as one, then they should also form a political union. So there are any number of political arrangements that would be suitable. But those political arrangements that would be suitable have to be arrangements that are produced by Africans themselves, that make sense for them. And that will affect peace and cooperation and development the most. More homogeneous states, more nimble, more agile economically, those are what are going to work. And I think that a good example of this is the case with Europe. The more it's divided itself into smaller states, the more there's been a recognition of the rights of ethnic groups to their territory, the more cooperation there has been in Europe. That is a necessary step for it. There are unities that divide, and then there are divisions that unify. Having these proper political arrangements or borders is one of those divisions that will actually unify people, not divide them.
Is international recognition a priority for Rol Naath? And how do you think that this recognition is going to be given to Rol Naath?
Great, thank you. As it stands right now, international recognition is not a big priority for Rol Naath. And I'll explain what I mean by international recognition. Typically, recognition comes in two senses, or autonomy anyways. There's de facto recognition or autonomy, and then there's de jure recognition or autonomy. De facto is in terms of what is on the ground. Is a region or a state operating as a state? Is it looking after its people? Is it on the road to development? Is it something that has responsible government? And those are facts that can be there, even though there isn't international recognition of that. The de jure recognition, where the rest of the world, or most of it, will say that we recognize Rol Naath or any other state and wish to have formal, political arrangements with it in terms of representatives or diplomats and the like. That is something that always comes in piecemeal, a little at a time. And so the aim of Rol Naath is not to be fully recognized by the rest of the world, because we know that that happens as a matter of having interactions, economic, political arrangements, and that is something that's going to happen over time. So our goal is to develop our people, to ensure that we have a system that works well for them, and to have economic relationships, business ties with partners out there that are practically minded. And so think of the example of Taiwan. Taiwan has a very strong relationship with the United States, yet the United States does not recognize it. In fact, much of the developed world doesn't recognize Taiwan, yet Taiwan is a first world country. So looking at that, our goal then, as Rol Naath, our goal is not recognition if it happens quickly. Yes, of course, absolutely, we'll accept it. There's no problem with that. But our goal is to work with countries that are willing to have relations with us in the way in which they might have business ties with a country like Taiwan. So international recognition is not a priority for us. Instead, what is our priority is business relations with those states, because we know that international recognition will come with time. And lastly, I will say this: when South Sudan came about, the world sort of held it as a mother would, as parents would their newborn child, and everything was made available to South Sudan. International recognition came almost unanimously. Large amounts of aid was put in. The United States, in fact, there's only one other country it's invested more in than South Sudan, and that is Afghanistan. And so South Sudan got all of this recognition, and what has happened? There's been nothing but constant violence, constant corruption. And so the question for us is this: does international recognition, does that give food to your people? Does that mean that there will be a non-corrupt system? Not at all. So we choose to focus on that which is important. And that which is important is having relationships with those who are interested in a practical model and practical development of a people.
Finally, do you think when all this process is over, do you think that South Sudan and Rol Naath will be able to have cordial relationship?
I believe so. The Nuer are very much interested in having cordial relationships with anyone. We respect the rights of others, and we expect that our rights would be also respected. And Rol Naath has, of course, a vested interest in there being cordial relationships between Rol Naath and other states in the region, indeed other states in the world. So the only party that would hamper or prevent cordial relationships would be South Sudan itself. We do not believe that South Sudan will be around much longer in order to have cordial relationships with South Sudan, because as anyone can read, the Nuer have not been the only ones, the only ethnic groups that has been treated badly. It is perhaps the one that has suffered the most at the hands of South Sudan because it's the next most capable one. However, the South Sudan itself, the South Sudanese government has done lots of terrible things. For instance, to the people of Equatoria, to the Shilluk Kingdom to the north, and various other smaller groups where there are waves of ethnic cleansing. The reason why the world knows about it when it comes to Rol Naath is because the Nuer are very vocal, and they've stood up against this ethnic cleansing, and they've protected their people. And so because of that, as they say in English, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So the Nuer have been very vocal, and we have been very determined that our people will not be wiped out. And so we've taken matters into our own hands and said we will close our borders and controlling our areas. And then now we're going out to the world to say, if anyone would like to have a business relationship with us, then we are more than ready. However, South Sudan, we feel it is only a matter of time before it blows up anyway. Because the systems of corruption and the like, they cannot go too far. And there are too many internal contradictions for it to survive much longer. So we imagine that in the near future, when all of this is done, that South Sudan will probably break up into, say, an equatorial region, and then we look forward to having a cordial relationship with them. Perhaps the Dinka themselves will break off into their own areas. And I think what you'll get in not too long will be a South Sudan that is a region, not a state. And once that happens, you will see development very quickly, and you'll see much better cordial relationships between peoples under the model of what happened in Yugoslavia. When Yugoslavia was under Joseph Tito, held together by a strong man, perhaps, one could say that Yugoslavia was working well, but there were hidden fault lines, ethnic and otherwise. And upon his death, what we saw is that it blew up. And only after there was a recognition that, okay, well, we have to allow for there to be autonomy, a sort of remedial autonomy given to these ethnic groups. Now you find that memorial programs are tended by the leaders of ethnic groups that were once their enemies. People that were wiping themselves out now have a sense of regional cooperation. So we see this working in so many different parts of the world. We see this reality that the more homogeneous ethnic groups, or the more homogeneous states, tend to have less corruption, and they tend to have higher GDPs. They tend to have a better political index when it comes to political culture and the like. And development, of course, happens much more quickly. And then as a region, they end up doing much better. So it's no mistake then that what you see in Europe. In Europe and Asia, you have the most ethnically homogeneous ethnic states. And then those are the parts of the world that are most developed. And then when you go to Africa, it is the most heterogeneous of all states. The landmass is 11.7 million square miles. Europe, I think, is about 4.9 or something. And yet there are about 44 states in Europe and only about 52 states in Africa. So, with much more different ethnic groups. And so that's why with much of Africa, there's just too much discord. And there will never be, in any real sense, any of the development that we see in Europe or Asia until this breakup into more sensible, more agile political units is made. So that would be my response there.
Thank you, really thank you for this great opportunity.
Pleasure was all mine. Thank you as well.